Begin today the Gemara on Daf Tes, 9 lines down from the top of the Yamud, where it says Maskeflo Rabbi Yitzchak. The Gemara is continuing the halacha that it said before regarding the Korban Pesach, that the Korban Pesach that's shechted all year round, that means any time besides Erev Pesach after Chatzos, it has the halacha of a Korban Shlomim. And if you have any kavanah shalei l'shma when you bring it, so then just like a Korban Shlomim, the Korban is kosher. So here as well, the Korban will be kosher. Now the Gemara learned it out before from a pasuk where it says ve'im min atzayin karbonai lezevach shlomim l'Hashem. And the Gemara said that pasuk is actually speaking about a Korban Pesach that comes from tzayin, and it's being shechted all year round, and it's going to be lezevach shlomim. The Gemara was discussing before, maybe we should say that Lezevach, Shlomim, since it's two separate points, as the Gemara said before, that even if you shecht it for any other carbon, like a Chatas, or Oila, Chatas, Asham, or Oila, it should become a carbon like them. The conclusion the Gemara said here is, the Gemara said two pshatim. One of the pshatim the Gemara said is, since it's Kachim Kalam before, it will become a shlomim, which is also kachim kalam, but it's not going to become a different kind of carbon, which is not kachim kalam. So that's how we know that it stays a shlomim, from a Pesach to a shlomim. But now here, the Gemara is going to ask that there's other kinds of karbanis that are similar, kachim kalam, to the Pesach, and maybe we could say that the Pesach, when you shecht it all year round, it becomes like those karbanis. That's the Gemara is going to bring a few different options. Maskeflo Rav Yitzchak Rabbi Savrin. This is the girsa that we have in the Gemara. His name was Rav Yitzchak Berebi. The word Savrin, it's not clear exactly what this name is. You don't find it anywhere in Shas. Some say that the word Savrin means that it was from the Rabbanan Sevuroi, which came really after the Almeroim. So he asked the question, maybe I could still say, Shachte l'shem meiser, if you shecht the Korban Pesach any time of the year, that it should be meiser, the halacha of meiser behema, which is also kachim kalim, like the Pesach itself. So lahevim meiser. So then it should become like the carbon of meiser behema. Why do we say that it only becomes a shlomim? Now lamai hilchasa, what would be the difference if you say it becomes a shlomim or if it becomes meiser? Now, if you were saying it becomes meiser, what would that mean? The lolibayin nisachim, that you wouldn't have to have the nisachim, the wine that you pour, together with the Korban Shlomim, but by a meiser there is no nisachim. And also, ulemilka or lemeika malei below yigal, and that there's a halacha by meiser. The pasuk says that meiser behema is kaidesh, and you cannot redeem it. So now this Korban Pesach shechted as meiser cannot be redeemed. And so the Gemara, Omakra, by meiser, the pasuk says, Ha'asiri yeh kaidesh, which means that only the 10th is Kaidesh, Zeh Meiser, Ve'en Acher Meiser. Only the one that's actually the 10th will become Meiser Behema, and there's no other that becomes Meiser Behema. So you can't say that this applies by the Pesach. Fragt the Gemara, but I could still say, Shachte L'Shem B'cher. If you shechted the Korban Pesach all year, that it should be a B'cher. It should have the same Kedusha like a B'cher, the firstborn, which is a carbon, and the meat goes to the Kayin. So L'Hevik a B'cher. It should become a B'cher and not a Shlomim. What would be the relevance of the fact that it's a b'chayr? Two things. First of all, also the leili boy nisachim. There's no nisachim for the b'chayr like the shlamim. Or inami the leisve lekayanim, that who eats the meat from this carbon, the kayanim eat the meat. That's the Gemara. It will not be a b'chayr because b'chayr nami avara mimaiser gamar. We learn out the gzeir shaveh. It says by the b'chayr v'havarta kopet rechem, and by meiser it also says a similar word kolesh yaver tachas hashevet. So we compare the two, that only the meiser itself is meiser behemer, only the b'chayr is a b'chayr, and not the Pesach that is not become a b'chayr. There's another option. Maybe if you shecht the Korban Pesach and he's shechting it for the sake that it should be a tumura of a carbon. That's when one tries to exchange a carbon for another. The exchange doesn't take effect, but what happens is that the second behema also becomes a carbon. So maybe here, this Pesach would become a tumura. What's the relevance of this? Lemilka allow. Number one, he's going to get malchus for this because by tumura it takes effect, but it's a lav, and therefore you get malchus. Or inami, another point, lemeika malei below yemacher below yigal, that we apply if you hear this that you're not and you can't redeem this tumura. There's actually some that are not great at this point of Lo Yigal, because in the pasuk Lo Yigal does not say in the Torah regarding Tumura. It says it regarding Meiser, as the Gemara quoted before. And it says the Gemara, the pasuk by Tumura says, V'hoya hu utmurasai, that it will be holy, and the Tumura also. But we learn from this, Zu Tumura, only the Tumura is going to be a Tumura. When you have a carbon and you're exchanging it and you're making a Tumura something else, then it takes effect. But ve'ein acher Tumura. But shechting a carbon Pesach, thinking that it'll be like a Tumura, it will not get the status of a Tumura. One more option, the Gemara says, but ve'eme, I could still say shachte l'shem taida. If you shecht the carbon Pesach all year, that it should be like a carbon taida. So lehevi ki taida should become like a taida, and lamai hilchasa, what would be the halacha of this? La'at inay lechem, that you would have to bring the breads, the 40 breads that come along with the carbon taida, you would have to bring that here now with this Pesach. Says the Gemara, but how could that be? Because mi ike midi, is there anything that you could say, the Pesach gufei loy boy lechem? The carbon Pesach itself does not require to bring any breads with it. But if it's leftovers, if this is a carbon Pesach, which for whatever reason was not brought on Erev Pesach, and now you're bringing it on any other day of the year, boy lechem, now you would require to bring breads with this. So you can't say that you bring the breads together with the Pesach. But why not? The Gemara says, Yehochi, if you're saying this, that since the Pesach itself does not require these breads, so therefore the rest of the year you should not have to bring breads with it either. So if so, hashtanami, now as well that we're saying that it has the halacha of a shlomim, mi yikim midi, is there anything you could say that the Pesach gufei loy boy nesachim, the carbon Pesach itself, you don't bring nesachim together with it, u'maisrei boy nesachim, but if it's leftovers and it becomes a shlomim, so now you have to pour wine and you do need nesachim with it. So for that, for the same reason, it should not have the halacha of a shlomim either. So the Gemara explains, anan hochi kamrinan. The question that we were asking here is as follows. Midi, is there anything, the Meiser Taida Atzma, looking at the Taida itself, that the leftovers of the Taida itself, and that is, let's say, a case where a person brought, he designated one carbon for a Taida, and for whatever reason he did not use it, it got lost and he used another, and now you have the leftovers of a Taida. So what's the halacha now when you have this carbon that was designated as a Taida? Loi boy lechem. So that leftover of a taida itself, so you don't bring any breads with it, but v'ilu meiser the asiluhu me'alme boy lechem. So you're going to say now that the Pesach, which is leftovers from the Pesach, and now it's being brought as a taida, that you should require to have breads for this. That can't be. Just like by the taida itself, we don't say such a thing. For sure, regarding the Pesach that's left over from the Pesach, you can't say that it would become a taida and you would have to bring breads with it. We're on Daf Tes, middle of Daf Tes. Okay, so this is the conclusion of the Gemara explaining why the carbon Pesach becomes only a shlomim when you shecht it all year round, but not any other carbon. Now the Gemara goes back to the original pasuk that it brought before as the source for this halacha. So as I mentioned in the beginning, it's on Daf Ches Amud Beis. The Gemara brought a pasuk where it says V'im min hatzayin karbanai l'zevach shlamim Hashem. The Gemara darshan, when it says hatzayin, it refers to the carbon Pesach that is usually brought from tzayin, from small livestock. And then now, if it's being shechted for a shlamim, it becomes a shlamim. That's the drasha of the pasuk. So the Gemara asks on that drasha, Daf Tes. Maskefla Rav Yemer, so Rav Yemer bereid Rav Hillel asks on this. How do you know that that pasuk is talking about the tzayin that was left over from a Pesach? Maybe that pasuk is actually talking about a person that had a carbon asham, and it was an extra carbon asham that he designated, and now it's leftovers from the asham, and it's on this that the pasuk is saying that if it's left over and you bring it as a carbon, it'll be a shlamim. Now, why is the Gemara suggesting this? Because the carbon asham also comes from tzayin, from small livestock. Actually, the carbon asham could only come from one kind of animal, an ayal, a ram, which is part of tzayin. It's part of small livestock. So maybe we could say that this pasuk here is saying that a leftover of an asham becomes a shlamim, Amar Rave, so Rave answers, no, it's not mistaver that it goes on the Asham. It makes more sense to say that it goes on the leftovers of the Pesach. Why? Because Amakra, the lashon of the pasuk is v'im minatzayin karbonoi lezevach shlamim. If you're bringing from a carbon that you designated from small livestock, and now you're bringing it as a shlamim. Now, what does this lashon tzayin mean? Davar hashave b'chol hatzayin. This refers only to a kind of carbon that can be brought by any kind of small livestock. And that refers only to a Pesach. Why? Because the Pesach could be brought from a lamb or from a goat. You have a choice. So that's from either one. So that's therefore tzayin includes all of this. Whereas by the Asham could only be brought from an ayil, from a ram. So therefore it doesn't go into the word tzayin, which includes more. Maskech lo Rav Avin bar Chiya. So Rav Avin bar Chiya asks, "There's Rav Yitem Rav Avin bar Kahane." B'chol asar. Usually, at Omrit, you say that the word min. It doesn't just say here v'im tzayin. It says min at tzayin, from tzayin. So usually you say that the word min, it means from or of it, but not all of it. So lahaitzi, that's actually a word which is an exclusion. V'kan min l'rabbis. Here you're saying that when it says v'im min at tzayin, it can't be referring to asham, which is only an ayol, a ram. It has to be referring to a Pesach that includes more. It includes also the possibility to bring from sheep or from a goat. Why are we saying that it's coming to be marbe and it refers to Pesach? And why aren't we focusing on the word min? Min means to exclude. So Amar Rav Mani, so Rav Mani explains, no, because hachanami min lahaitzi. Yeah, it means the carbon Pesach, because it says tzayin, which includes a carbon that can be brought from more than one kind of animal, but then min is an exclusion here, even if it's the carbon Pesach. Why is that? Because the li'asi ben shtei shanim. A carbon Pesach could only be brought from an animal that's 1 year old, not an animal that's 2 years old. That's one thing it comes to exclude. And also, v'li'asi nekeva. And the carbon Pesach does not come from an nekeva. And therefore, v'im and atzayin, the lashon of this pasuk, it's logical that it refers dafke to the carbon Pesach. And on this, the pasuk is saying, when you bring it any day of the year, what happens? It becomes a carbon shlamim. Maskef lo Rav Chana Bagad Tor, Rav Chana from Baghdad, or from Baghdad Tor, he asks a question on this. Umi matzis amris. How could you say the chiksiv hai that this pasuk here, v'im menatzayin karbonoi, is b'maisa Pesach ksiv? It's talking about what was left over of a carbon Pesach being brought all year. But v'ha medichsiv in the hemshech of this parsha, after it says v'im menatzayin karbonoi, the pasuk goes on to say that im kesef. What's if it's going to be a kesef, a lamb, v'im eis, or if it's going to be a goat? So the pasuk spells out these two details of the kesef and the eis. The question is, why is the pasuk spelling this out? If when it says the first time tzayin, it's referring to the carbon Pesach, we know already from other places in the Torah that the carbon Pesach is brought from either a lamb or a goat. Why did the Torah have to come and spell out over here separately? And if it's going to be a lamb or it's going to be a goat? So the fact that the Torah spells that out, miklal, the lab, b'moisa Pesach siv. So it would seem that this itself proves that it's not talking about the leftovers from a Pesach, it's just talking about a carbon shlamim that can be brought from a lamb or from a goat. And says the Gemara, no, it still could be talking about a carbon Pesach, but there's a specific reason why the Torah spells out separately the lamb and the goat, because ahumi boyele, the Torah is spelling this out for the following halacha. Like at the Tanya, as we learned in a Braise, that when the Torah here says kesev, it's not keves, the Torah says kesev. So why is the Torah spelling out the lamb? Because it's coming to teach you l'rabbis es a Pesach la'aliyah. It's coming to say that by the carbon Pesach, if it's being brought with a lamb, so then what happens? The tail as well has to be brought as a carbon. In the psukim, the parsha of carbon Pesach, it doesn't spell out clearly that the tail should be brought in the mizbeach as well. But over here, the Torah is spelling out separately the kesev to say that the tail also has to be brought. Because if you look in the Hemshech of the Parsha, Rashi brings the pasuk there. It says L'umas ha'otze yisirena, which refers to that area in the animal in the back where the tail is, and there it says that has to be brought in the mizbeach. So the Torah specifically spelled out here kesef for this reason. So you should know that by the Pesach, if it's a lamb, then the tail is brought. Now the Braisa goes on to say, Kishu Oimer im kesev. What does the Torah mean here when it says this parsha of im kesev? L'rabbis Pesach she'ibrosh nasa. It's speaking about the carbon Pesach that its year has already passed. As we just said before, Korban Pesach could only be brought when it's 1 year old. So this is already, the year has passed. Or Shlomim, Haba Machmas Pesach, or it also is referring to the Korban Shlomim that you bring together with the Pesach. That's actually the Chagigah on Erev Pesach. If you have more people that are eating, so you bring a Korban Chagigah as well with the Pesach. L'chol mitzvahs Shlomim, that if they're brought on every day of the year, then they're brought like a regular shlomim, sheyatinu smicha, which means you have to do smicha to lean your hands on the animal, and the sachim, and then the wine of nufas chazav b'shoik. You lift up the breast and the shoik, the thigh, when you bring this korban. That's what the Torah writes in Kesef, that it's speaking about the korban Pesach. And then kishu ha'omer v'im eis, then the Torah says separately, if it's a goat, hifzik inyan, the Torah here is separating, and it's telling you limid ala eis. From here you learn regarding the goat she'enet tuna alya, that when you bring the goat as a korban Pesach, so then the tail is not brought on the Mizbeach. That's what you learn from here. So you see over here, this Bryce is also saying that this parsha is speaking about the korban Pesach. But the thing is, here it's saying that you learn it out from these psukim, im kesev, im eis. It does not say here that you learn it out from the pasuk v'im minatzayin karboni that it says in the beginning of that parsha. So the Gemara asks on this, do I learn out this halacha that a korban Pesach brought all year becomes a shlomim from these psukim? It's learned out from the psukim before, as the father of Shmuel said. The father of Shmuel said, if you bring from small livestock your korban, it becomes a shlomim. What is this referring to? Davar, haba, menatzayin, a korban Pesach that's brought from small livestock, it becomes a korban shlomim. So I see this, now we have two different sources to say that the korban Pesach all year becomes a shlomim. So the Gemara goes on to say now, before it answers this question, that there's actually a third source that we find for this. But Vakati midirav Nachman Omar Rabba Baravu Nafke. There's actually a third source that the Gemara already also brought before. Rav Nachman, the name of Rabba Baravu, says you learn it from here. The Omar Rav Nachman Omar Rabba Baravu Minayin L'Moisa Pesach Shekarav Shlomim. From where do I know that when a Pesach is left over and it wasn't brought in its time, that it's brought all year as a shlomim? Shenem, the pasuk says, "V'zavachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha." You shech the korban Pesach, and then the pasuk goes on to say, what's the korban Pesach brought from? Tzayin ubakar. It's brought from tzayin, small livestock, and bakar, large livestock. And the question is, how could this be referring to a korban Pesach? The korban Pesach is only brought from a lamb or from goats. So over here it mentions bakar, which is not a lamb or a goat. So Elov, so Rav Nachman said, from here you learn out, mikan l'meisara Pesach. From here I learned that the leftover of a Pesach, what happens to it? It becomes a korban that could be brought from small livestock or from large livestock. What korban is this? Shlomim. It will become a shlomim. So what happens now? So the Gemara here is pointing out that we actually have three different psukim that's a source for this halacha that a korban Pesach brought all year will be a shlomim. So why do we need all these three sources? Answers the Gemara Elat Lasa Kroik CV. So we have over here three different psukim because they're speaking about different circumstances when the korban Pesach was not brought as a Pesach and now it's going to be brought on another day of the year. Chad, one pasuk is Le'ibras Manoi Ve'ibras Nosai. A korban Pesach that the time of shechting it on Erev Pesach is already gone, and also the age of the animal is Ibrash Nasai. It's not anymore a year old. It's already older than a year old, and then it's not even raw yet, or it's not fit to be brought as a Pesach. So then, in such a case, it's not fit at all for the korban Pesach on both of these accounts, so you can bring it as a shlamim in the rest of the year. Another pasuk that is coming to add Ibras Manoi. This is the time of korban Pesach passed, but v'loish nasai. But it's still within a year. The age of the animal is still within a year, and it still could be brought as a Pesach. Right. So in such a case, you would think that it's not brought as a shlomim, because you can use it for Pesach Sheni. You can still bring it as a Pesach. And then the third pasuk teaches an even bigger chiddush. A korban Pesach that was designated as a korban, and it's still before Pesach. You can wait and bring it on Erev Pesach after Chatzais, and it's also the animal is the right age. It's still a year old and under a year old, and you can bring it. So therefore, you have to have the pasuk for all of these three. Okay, so the Gemara here now spells out the svaris actually. So it says the Gemara tzrichi. So I need the pasuk for all these three cases because these are cases of Rachman Achad. If we would only say one pasuk half a minute, then I would say that Han and Mili. What is this going on? If it's only a carbon that both the time of Pesach is over and also the age of the animal, it's too old already. So since it was completely removed from being possible to use it for a Pesach, that's why it becomes a shlamim. But if it's taka Pesach is over, but the animal is still within a year, the chazi le Pesach sheni. So now you could still use it for Pesach sheni. I would say it does not become a shlamim. Now because of Rachmana Hani Tarti, even if the Torah would write these two psukim, I would say mishum de itchi lohu mimul sayu. There's some aspect of it that changed, that's already over, that it's pushed off from either the time or the age or both. But if it's a carbon that you designated for a Pesach, and it's still before Pesach, you could still wait to bring it on Erev Pesach, and it's also the right age, the Chazil Pesach, I would say that if you want to bring the carbon right, then it will not become a carbon shlomim. So therefore we need, and we have the third pasuk to tell me that it will become a shlomim. So Mefarshim point out that from this last point you see that this idea that a Pesach that's brought all year becomes a Shlomim, the pshat here is, it's not that it's a Pesach, and then when it can't be brought as a Pesach, then it changes. It gets this new status that it becomes into a Shlomim. What you see from the Gemara is, when you're makdish, a carbon Pesach, in essence, you're being makdish a carbon that is a Pesach, but also has a name of Shlomim in it right from the beginning. V'haraya, even when it's still fit to be brought as a Pesach, but if you want to bring the carbon right then and there, it'll become a Shlamim. That means that it's incorporated right in the beginning and being makdish as a Pesach, that it has a name of Shlamim in it as well. Okay, now the Gemara brings a statement here, and the Gemara will go through a long discussion. What's the right version of this statement here? This is going back to the halacha of the carbon chatas. The carbon chatas has to be brought l'shma, and if it's not brought l'shma, then it's going to be pasul. And there's two halachas, which the Gemara is going to be going back and forth. We had before, there's the halacha of shini kodesh, when you bring the carbon chatas, and you brought it with the wrong lishma, not lishma, you brought it for another carbon. And then there's shini bailim, when you bring it for a kapara, not for this owner, but for someone else. Okay, let's see. Amar Rav Mishmei de Mavoig. Rav said in the name of Mavoig, which is a name of a chacham, that chatas sheshachta l'shum chatas nachshain. If you're bringing a carbon chatas, and your kavana is that you're bringing it, that it should be what kind of a chatas? The chatas of Nachshain. What's this chatas of Nachshain? Nachshain brought a chatas by the inauguration of the Mishkan. Now, the point about this chatas that Nachshain brought is, it wasn't really a regular chatas, because it wasn't a carbon that was brought as a kapara for any aveda. It was really brought just as a gift, like similar to a carbon oila. But it was called a chatas. So he brought this carbon, the kayin, and he has in mind that it should be like the chatas of Nachshain. So Rav said, Ksheira, that this carbon will be kosher. Because the Amakra, the Torah says, Zois Torah sachatas, that you should bring it, and it should have the Torah of a chatas on it. Torah achas l'chol achatois. So from this term, Torah sachatas, I learn out that all karbonis chatas have the same halacha to it. So even if you're bringing it for such a kind of chatas, which is really sort of a chatas in name only, but it's not really a chatas for an aveda. It's more like a oila, that is. It's more like a oila by Nachshain, but nevertheless it has the name chatas, so therefore it's still going to be l'shma for the chatas and it'll be kosher. Okay, so the Gemara asks on this, Yosef Rava v'kama lala hashmaita. He said over this halacha, and Eisvei Rav Misharshi l'Rava, so Rav Misharshi asks Rava on this. This is a Mishnah that says, this is or actually a Braisa. This is in regarding menachas. So just like by a carbon, you have to bring it l'shma. So by menachas, there's similar halachas. So Rab Shimon says, Kala menachas, by the carbon mincha shenikmitzu shaloi l'shman, the kemitza, when you separate, you take off some of the flour to be brought and to be burnt on the mizbeach. And if that was done shaloi l'shma ksheirais, the carbon mincha will still be kosher. And not only will the mincha itself be kosher, but v'olu lebailem l'shum chayva. Even for the owner that brought this carbon, he will fulfill his obligation. So this is Rab Shimon. The Chachamim argue on this, and they say that it's similar to what we learned by a carbon, that it'll be kosher, but the owner does not fulfill his obligation. But Rab Shimon says, no, by the mincha, it'll be completely kosher, and for the owner's obligation as well. He explains why this is. You can't compare the carbon mincha, the flour carbon, to an animal of a carbon. Why? Because the point that he's going to explain over here is, by the carbon mincha, there are different types of carbonis mincha. When you have kavanah from one for the other, you're having a wrong, not l'shma, but l'shem, another carbon mincha, the physical way the carbon mincha is brought is completely different. So therefore your kavanah shalei l'shma will not have an effect. As he explains here. Because sha'kaimitz machvas l'shem marcheshes. If the kayin took the kemitzi, did the avodah of the mincha, and it's supposed to be a machvas. A machvas is a kind of carbon mincha that's a very flat pan, where you fry in it the carbon mincha, which comes out very flat. But he had kavanah that instead it should be a different kind of mincha. What kind of a mincha? A marcheshes. A marcheshes is more of a deep fry. It has walls around it, and it's deep fry. That's what marcheshes is called. So he has in mind for a different kind of mincha. So his kavanah l'shalei l'shma will not have any effect. Why? Because the action, the way the actual carbon itself is brought, shows clearly what it is, and therefore his machshava won't change what he's doing. Shehi machvas, it's clear that this is a machvas because it's a flat pan. Similar also if he's bringing a carbon mincha which is a chareva, which is dry, meaning it's just a carbon mincha of flour without oil. This is when it's for a chatas, for a chayta, you don't add any oil to it. And he brings it l'shem belula, then it should be a carbon mincha where you do mix oil in it. So his machshava shalei l'shma won't have an effect either. Why? Because masel mechichin shehi chareva. His actions that he's doing shows. It's clear. We see that it's a carbon mincha without any oil. That's by a carbon mincha. Aval bezvachim einekei. When it comes to a carbon of a behemoth, so over here the machshava shalei l'shma will have an effect. Why? Because shchita achas lekulan. The slaughtering is the same by all. Kabbalah achas lekulan. When you receive the blood, it's the same. Zrika achas lekulan. The spraying of the blood is the same. So therefore, over here, when you have the kavanah shalei l'shma, this will invalidate the carbon, or it will, even if the carbon is still kosher, but for the owner, he will not fulfill his obligation. This is the halacha that Rab Shimon said. So now, what do you see over here? So the Gemara now explains what the question over here is. You see from what Rab Shimon said that the only reason why the machshava shalei l'shma from one mincha to another mincha will not have any effect, because the maseh machichin. Because you look at the action of how the carbon is brought, it's clear what it is, so the machshava doesn't do anything. But if the actions of the way the carbon is brought would not prove anything, so then I wouldn't apply this inyan. I would say that if you bring a mincha and you're having in mind to bring it for another kind of a mincha, it would become pasul, or at least the owner would not fulfill his obligation here. But the question is, why would I say such a thing? If you darshan this kind of a pasuk before we darshan, Zais Tairas Achatas, that as long as it's being brought for a carbon that has the name Chatas, then it's going to be kosher. So here as well by a mincha, Leime, why wouldn't we darshan here, Zais Tairas HaMincha? It says in the Taira, Zais Tairas HaMincha, which would mean Taira Achas, L'chol HaMenachis, that there's one halacha for any kind of mincha that you bring and it should still be kosher. So this is a question from Rab Shimon. Rashi says that the Gemara is bringing a chiddush that the question is even according to Rab Shimon that says that by mincha the kavanah shalei l'shma does not take effect. But nevertheless, if it would be the same, then it would be a problem. But for sure, this is a question according to the Chachamim. The point is, we prove from here that we don't darshan zayis tairas amincha that all minchas are the same. So therefore, similar regarding zayis tairas achatas, we don't darshan from there to say that if you bring the carbon for chatas of nachshayin, that it would take effect. Another important point Rashi explains over here, that the Gemara is discussing this all specifically regarding this kind of a case where he's bringing it l'shem the chatas of nachshayin. Because as I mentioned before, the chatas of nachshayin is a different kind of chatas. It's not really a chatas. It's more like an oila than a chatas. It's this that the Gemara is discussing whether it should take effect or not, and it's comparing it to these minchas here, which are also two different types of minchas. A mincha that's marcheshes, minchas machvas, has a different name. But when you bring a chatas, we had before in the Gemara, if you bring a chatas of chelev, the Aveda was forbidden fats, and it brings it l'shem another chatas which was for blood, that's mamish the same kind of chatas. Over there it's going to be kosher. That's not what our Gemara is discussing over here. Okay, so Ella, the Gemara switches the statement that Rav said in the name of Mavik. Ella yitma hachi yitma, rather you have to learn this as follows. Amar Rav Mishmei the Mavik, what Rav said in the name of Mavik is Chatos sheshachta amanas she iskaper bonachshin. So the kavanah shalei l'shma over here was not a shini kaidesh for a different carbon chatas, rather it's a shini bailim. The kain is bringing the carbon, and he's having in mind that it's not going to be a kapara for the owner that's bringing this carbon chatas. Who's it going to be a kapara for? For nachshain. Ksheida. It's going to be kosher. Why is that? Because ein kapara lemesim. There's no such a thing as a kapara for someone that passed away already. And we learned before, when you bring a carbon shalei l'shma for the wrong owner, a kapara for the wrong owner, it's only if that owner is chayiv in a carbon similar to the person that's actually bringing the carbon now. Then that will take effect to ruin the lishma of the carbon. But over here, you're thinking shaloi lishma for someone that's not even alive anymore. He's not mechuyev b'chlal on this kind of carbon now, so it doesn't take effect. It's kavanah shaloi lishma. That's what Rav said. So the Gemara asks, if that's what he was saying, v'leimen meis ba'alma, so then you could just say the din. If a person brings a carbon and he has in mind that it should be for someone that already passed away, that kavanah will not ruin the carbon. Why is he saying the case of nachshin? Answers the Gemara, Hakamash Malon, because this is what he's coming to say here. Taime the mace. The reason why the carbon will still be kosher is because Nachshon passed away. Chai dumye de Nachshon psula. But if he was still alive and you're bringing it for someone that's bringing a carbon similar to Nachshon, then the carbon actually will be possible. What does it mean, a carbon similar to Nachshon? What is this? So here the Gemara brings another example of a chatos that's similar to nachshan in the sense that it's not being brought for an aveda. It's also being brought for, what is this? Chatos nazir v'chatos mitzaira. A nazir has to bring a chatos, and a mitzaira brings a chatos, and it's not for an aveda. And in such a case, if you're having in mind that it should be a kapara for this person that's bringing a chatos nazir or a chatos mitzaira, it's going to passel the carbon. But the Gemara asks in this, how could you say this? Hani oilois ninu, the chatas of a nazir and a chatas of a mitzaira, it's basically a chatas in name only, but it's more like an oila. It's not a person that did an aveda like it is by a regular carbon chatas. So what's the question of the Gemara? By shini bailim, this is a rule we have to always remember here. When a person has kavanah shalei lishma, and what is shalei lishma? Shini bailim, that it should be for a different person, the kapara, it only ruins the carbon if that other person is chayiv in a carbon similar to this chatas that's being brought now. So if you have a kavanah shalei lishma for a different bailim, which are bringing a chatas for a nazir or for a mitzaira, it's like an oila. It's not similar to the carbon that's being brought now, and therefore it should not passel this carbon. So the Gemara again switches what Rav said. Eloi itmar hachi itmar. Rather, what Rav said is Amar Rav Mishmei the Mavik. Chatos sheshachta al shemechuyev chatos kenachshain. A person that shechs the carbon and he's thinking that it should be for someone that's chayev a chatos like nachshain. As we just said, that would be a nazir or a mitzayra that are bringing a chatas, which is more like an ayla. So in such a case, ksheira, this kavanah shalei lishma does not affect this chatas because this kind of chatas of a nazir and a mitzayra is not similar to a regular chatas, and therefore, regarding shini bailim, it is not pasla. The carbon is kosher because chatas nachshain ayli, the chatas of a nachshain is more like an ayla. Ikeda Amar. Others say yet another version of what Rav said. Amarav Mishmei de Mavik. Rav said in the name of Magav, and then this is going back actually, not to the kavana of Shalei Lishma of Shini Bailim, but we're going back to Shalei Lishma of Shini Kaidesh, where he shechts it for another carbon. Chatas Shashachta L'Shem Chatas Nachshain. If you're shechting your carbon chatas, and you're having in mind that it should be for what kind of a chatas, the chatas of Nachshain, so now you're shechting it for a different kind of a carbon. Psula, it's going to be pasul. You may think, well, I still shechted it for a chatas. No, because chatas nachshain oylahi. The chatas of nachshain is really a carbon oyla. It's more like an oyla than a chatas. Fragt the Gemara, if that's the point, v'leime chatas nazir v'chatas mitzayra. Why didn't he say this halacha? It should be the same thing by a chatas nazir and a chatas mitzayra, where the chatas is more like an oyla than a chatas, and therefore the kavana shalei lishma of shini kachim for a different kind of carbon. That's the point that he's saying, that it should become possible. Why did he choose this strange example of chatas nachshain? Answers the Gemara, Iker chatas nachkat. You're right, but he chooses the first example where you find this a kind of chatas that is really more like an oila, and therefore if you have this kavana for carbon chatas nachshain, when you're bringing a carbon chatas, that's a different kind of carbon, it's shaloi lishma, and it'll be possible. Now, Omar Rav, what the other gears here is Omar Rav. The Gemara here brings a halacha that it already said before. It's sort of as an introduction for an iboye that the Gemara is going to ask. So Rav said, chatos chaylev sheshachta l'shem chatas dam. When you shecht a chatos that's being brought for forbidden fats, and you're shechting it for a chatos that was for blood, or l'shem chatas avedas kechavim, or for a chatas that's being brought when someone served avedas zara b'shegeg. Ksheira. It's going to be kosher because they all have the same name of chatas, and it's the same kind of chatas, brought for an aveda that there's a chiyuv kares on it. However, as we said before, l'shem chatas nazir, l'shem chatas mitzayda. If you bring a chatas, but it's for the sake of a different kind of chatas altogether, not for an aveda of kares, and that's for a nazir or for a mitzayda, then psula. Then it's going to be possible because hani oilas ninu. These karbanis are more like an oila. But now here comes the iboya. Boy Rave, so the Shaila Rave asks is Chatos Chaylev Sheshachta L'Shem Chatos the Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav. You're bringing the carbon chatos for regular chatos for forbidden fats, and it's being shechted for what kind of a chatos? The chatos brought for a person that walked into the Beis Hamikdash when he's tamei, or ate from a carbon when he's tamei. Mahu. What's the halacha here? Is it going to passel this? Is this a kavanah shalei l'shma that will passel the carbon or not? What's the shaila? Me, Amrin, do I say kares kamaisa that this carbon chatos for tumas mikdash v'kadoshav is similar to this chatos that you're bringing now? It's also a chatos because you chayev kares for that, just like for the carbon, for the chaylev, for the forbidden fats, and therefore it's still going to be kosher. You still brought it l'shem a chatos that's similar to what you're bringing now. Or I could say that ein kavua kamaisa. By the Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav, this chatas is called a carbon oila v'yayit, because it depends on the person's financial situation, what kind of carbon you bring. So maybe that's already considered to be a different kind of chatas, and therefore it's going to pass to the carbon you're bringing. So Ravache bereded Rave Masni, Ravache, the son of Rave, so he taught and said, Kulu l'psula. When you bring a carbon chatas, no matter what other kavana you have, besides for this actual carbon that you're bringing now, whatever else you think it's for, even for another kind of chatas as well, it's all going to be possible. My time, what's the reason? Because it says in the pasuk, v'shachat oisa lachatos, it has to be l'shem oisa chatos. It has to be for the exact chatos that you're bringing it now. So Ravacha, the son of Rav, is saying different than it said before, that if you're bringing a chatas for forbidden fats, and you're having in mind that it should be a chatas for blood, it's not the exact chatas that you're bringing now, so it's going to be totally possible. So there's no room for any ibaya over here at all. It says clearly it has to be oisa chatas, this very chatas. So Amalei Ravashi l'Ravacha bereid Rave. So Ravashi asks Ravacha, the son of Rave, so boy the Rave heichem asnitela. So this ibaya of Rave, his father Rave, that asked this question. So Rave did ask an ibaya over here about a chatas that's being brought l'shem. The chatas that he's bringing now is the chatas for chaylev, and he's bringing it l'shem, a chatas for tumas mikdash v'kadoshav, and he had a shaila about that. How did he have a shaila? According to what Ravache Bereid Rav is saying, as long as it's not brought for this very chatas, it's a problem. So in what case did Rav have any ibaya about this? Amalei, so Ravache answered that there's two different cases here. There's shini kodesh and shini bailim. Regarding shini kodesh, if you bring a carbon of a chatas and you're thinking for another kind of carbon chatas, it's going to be a problem. It has to be for this specific chatas. But then there's a different din of shini bailim. When you're thinking that it should be a kapara for a different person, there is where there's a room for an ibaya, as he explains. Anan b'shini bailim asninallah. I learned that the ibaya of Rave was only in the case where he's thinking for a different person, the kapara. And this is how we learned this halacha. Omar Rave said, Chatas chaylev sheshachta al mi shemechuyev chatas dam v'chatas avedas kechavim. If you're shechting this carbon chatas, and you're thinking the kapara should be for a different person, and that other person is chayev also to bring a chatas, similar kind of chatas, whether for blood or for avedas zara, so then psula, it's going to be possible. Because over here, what's the halacha by shini bailim? By shini bailim, the halacha is the opposite, that it's only going to passel the carbon if you think that it should be brought for another person that's similar to the carbon that you're bringing now. So when you bring it for another person that's bringing the same kind of chattas that you're bringing now, and that it should be a kapara for him, that actually passes the carbon.
Where it's the
That's
oil,
the halacha.
if it's the oil or something else, then
Right, but it does not passel.
Right.
Because since his kapara is totally different, it does not doesn't do anything. Right, that's the halacha by sheni baila. So now here was the ibaya of Rava. Ami shemechuyev chatas naziv v'chatas mitzayra. If it's being brought the carbon chatas, you're bringing a regular carbon chatas, and you're thinking that it should be a kapara for who? For someone that's chayiv in a chatas of a nazir or a chatas of a mitzayre. That's not a regular kind of chatas at all. Ksheira, that's going to be kosher, as the Gemara explained before. That's more like an oila. So since the kapara of that individual is not at all similar to the kapara of this regular carbon chatas, it doesn't at all ruin the carbon. Now, so here was the ibaya. Rav, the Shaila Rav asked is chatas chaylev sheshachta al misha mechuyev chatas etumas mikdash v'kadasha of a regular carbon chatas brought for forbidden fats and a isser of karis, and it was being brought having in mind that it should be a kapara sheni bailim. It should be a kapara for someone that is bringing a carbon for his chatas for walking to the Beis Hamikdash tamei. Mahu, what's the halacha here? Will it pass the carbon or not? What's the shaila? Mi amrinan karis kamaisa. Do I say that it's karis, that isser of walking to the Beis Hamikdash tamei is karis, just like eating from forbidden fats, and therefore it will pass the carbon? Because the sheni bailam, again, is only possible if you think for someone else that's chayiv in a similar kind of kapara. Or I say, ein kavua kamaisa. No, that carbon though is not a set carbon like this carbon, as a different, as a din of oil v'yayred, and therefore it's a different category of a carbon, and therefore the kavana of shini bailim will not pass the carbon. Teiku, so this remains unresolved. Okay.